Wow, what a great group we have here. Thanks for that warm welcome. I wasn't expecting a standing ovation. Just kidding. It's a little different to do a talk without seeing anybody who you're talking to. My name is Justin Dodson, and I'm the forest silviculturist on the Shawnee National Forest. I've been in my position for about 5 years now. Today I'll be talking about forest management projects on the Shawnee National Forest and taking a look at the silvicultural tools that were utilized and the mechanisms to accomplish them on the ground. I'm originally from Central Illinois, a little town called Mason City. You've probably never heard of it. I first moved down to Southern Illinois in 2001, where I completed my bachelor's degree in forestry at SIU. I then continued on to get my master's in forestry human dimensions at SIU. It was during my master's that I first got a seasonal position with the Shawnee National Forest, and after graduation I was fortunate enough to get a full-time permanent position with the Forest Service. In 2010 I took a job as a reforestation technician on the Schwaming Nicolet in northern Wisconsin. During that time I was fortunate enough to get a forester position and ended up staying there for 6 years. During that time I was accepted into the National Advanced Silviculture program, which is essentially a master's degree in silviculture. The program includes 13 weeks of classes at 4 universities across the U.S. and then a paper defended to a panel of experts. I received my national certification in 2016, which was basically when I got the job here on the Shawnee. All right, enough about me. Some of you might know what the Forest Service does, but it still surprises me every day how many people don't. It's a common occurrence to hear someone say, "Oh, you work for the forestry," or "Do you work for the DNR?" So I just wanted to share with you what the Forest Service is. First, we're an agency under the Department of Agriculture, and we provide for multiple uses on the lands that we manage. Our mission statement is to sustain the health, diversity, and productivity of the nation's forests and grasslands to meet the needs of present and future generations. The purpose is to support nature in sustaining life. And how do we do that balance between short and long-term needs of the people? We do it through collaboration, delivering world-class science, technology, and land management. By providing access to resources and experiences that promote economic, ecological, and social vitality, and connecting people to the land and one another. I've given several interviews and talks at events across Southern Illinois, and if you've heard any of those, you probably understand my passion for maintaining forest health, diversity, and productivity on the Shawnee. I took this job because I was concerned about the trajectory the forest was on. Though forest health, diversity, and productivity are central to why we do forest management, I told a coworker that people are probably getting sick of me preaching about it. But sorry, I won't stop preaching until everyone knows. But for this talk, I'm going to do something different and highlight some of the good projects working to improve those conditions that are happening across the forest. In particular, I'm going to talk about 3: prescribed fire, stand improvement, which stand improvement doesn't have to be timber stand improvement. It can be for a variety of reasons why you're trying to improve stand conditions. And lastly, I'll talk about harvesting and briefly talk about a project with research that's happening on the Shawnee. The first project I want to talk about is the Pleasant Valley Prescribed Burn. The Pleasant Valley Prescribed Burn is approximately 3,000 acres located in Pope County. Ownership includes both federal and private lands. The burn area falls within a stewardship cluster identified by the Let the Sun Shine In Collaborative. These clusters are areas of priority forest acres with high biodiversity and a matrix of ownerships where resources can be pooled to achieve cross-boundary forest management objectives more efficiently. The objective of the burn was to reintroduce fire as a natural disturbance, to reduce understory shade-tolerant species, improve light and site conditions to promote shade tolerance, including oak and hickory and the associated species with that ecosystem, and to reduce fuel loads. The silvicultural tools used were prescribed fire, both on federal and private lands, and stand improvement activities, which occurred only on private. The mechanism to complete the burn was a partnership collaboration in which resources were shared across boundaries to complete the objectives of the burn. Several thousand acres is a large burn for southern Illinois, and it takes some serious planning to pull off. Partners for the Pleasant Valley burn included the U.S. Forest Service, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the IDNR, the Nature Conservancy, the Southern Illinois Prescribed Burn Association, and several private landowners around the burn. The majority of the burn is in oak hickory forest type with some mixed hardwood and pine forest types intermixed. Several natural areas exist within the project area boundary, including limestone barrens, sandstone cliffs, and xeric forest communities. At least 10 private landowners with FDA plans were also included in the burn. It was conducted on April 2nd, 2019. Hand line ignitions were conducted around the perimeter to secure the lines, and then aerial helicopter ignitions fired off the interior. The Pleasant Valley burn was an excellent example of cross-boundary partnerships to achieve forest management objectives. The burn expanded two smaller burns that were difficult to burn and hold. It eliminated a half-mile of dozer line and moved the lines to natural and man-made features that were easier to hold and patrol. Private landowners were able to implement their FDA plans more efficiently to meet their forest management objectives. In talking with one of the partners, he said what stood out to him post-burn was the smaller tree mortality on the thinner soils revealed that the glade was once larger than he had come to know, which is pretty cool. The next project that I want to talk about is a stand improvement project between the Shawnee National Forest and the National Wild Turkey Federation. The project was completed utilizing the Stewardship Agreement. Stewardship Authority allows the Forest Service to enter into agreements to exchange goods for services, exchange funds for services, or a combination of the two to complete restoration activities on National Forest System lands. There must be mutual interest and mutual benefit for the parties involved, which in this case there was. So for the stand improvement project, the objectives were to maintain and restore oak hickory forest conditions, maintain and restore open lands, and reduce non-native invasive species to improve wildlife habitat. The silvicultural tools that were utilized included manual cutting, mechanical mastication, and herbicide use. The mechanism to complete it was a stewardship agreement in partnership between the Shawnee and the National Wild Turkey Federation. A variety of Forest Service, NWTF, and grant funds were utilized in the agreement to fund treatments. NWTF solicited bids and administered the work to completion. This allowed for more habitat acres to be treated on Forest Service lands. Since 2008, we've completed 156 acres of pre-commercial thinning crop tree release, 381 acres of young release of natural and planted trees, 357 acres of stump sprout control with herbicide, 68 acres of woody non-native invasive species cutting, 185 acres of midstory removal with cut stump treatments, and 240 acres of open land mastication. In the following slides, I'll highlight some of those projects. The pre-commercial thinning crop tree release that was completed occurred mostly in the oakwood bottoms and the big muddy bottomland forests. All treatment stands were around 30-year-old clear-cut or seed tree harvests. Regeneration was natural, and a mixture of species were present and varied, but the majority of the species were oak and hickory. Treatment included favoring mass-producing species, improving spacing, and providing space for canopy expansion of the existing trees to improve mass production. Species desired to leave were oaks, hickories, persimmon, cypress, and hackberry, while reducing the presence of shade-tolerant and light-seeded species. Trees were cut manually with no herbicide use. The picture on the left is right after the cutting in 2018. and the picture on the right is that same stand 3 years later. Nearly all hardwood species stump sprout. Previous stand improvement treatments in oak wood only had the use of cutting in the silvicultural toolbox, and the stump sprouting was prolific, as you can see in the picture on the left. In some spots, this created similar light conditions near the ground as before treatment, limiting oak and hickory regeneration. By completing a NEPA analysis to utilize herbicide, we were able to return to some of those areas and cut those stump sprouts at ground level and treat the stump with herbicide, which you can see on the picture on the right. The blue that you see on the stumps is a dye that's added to the herbicide mixture to identify that the stump has already been treated. This past fall, we completed 185 acres of midstory removal in the Big Muddy Bottomland Forest just south of Howerton Road. The stands are relatively healthy, but getting up there in age for the species that are present. The under and midstory were mostly shade-tolerant species with a minor amount of oak and hickory. The prescription called for cutting shade tolerance below the overstory and treating the stumps with herbicide to prevent sprouting. Improved light conditions to the forest floor should be favorable to promote oak and hickory regeneration. Shawnee has been planting a variety of bottomland oak species in the Oakwood Green Tree Reservoir since around 2007. Canopy gaps were installed to provide enough light to the planted trees. As a part of the NWTF agreement, we returned to some of those areas to release the planted and natural oaks growing in those gaps. Because the planted trees were competing against rootstock that was cut to install the gaps, they were quickly being outcompeted. Desired trees were located and the competitors were cut around them. You can see in the photo some of those 6 to 10 foot oaks that were planted that are now released in the gap and receiving full sun. 240 acres of open land mastication has or will occur under the NWTF agreement. I think that equates to 7 managed open lands that are spread out across the forest. These mastication activities that have occurred have maintained important open land habitat by removing native and non-native woody encroachment on these habitats. These are just a few of the projects accomplished under the NWTF Stewardship Agreement that I wanted to share. This has been a mutually beneficial partnership for both the NWTF and the Shawnee. We are currently working on updating the agreement to add some planting, forest disease management, and more mid-story stand improvement activities that would occur over the next couple years. The Shawnee has about 262,000 acres of forested land, but not all those acres are available to harvest. Wilderness is an example where harvest activities are prohibited. Only half of the total acres are suitable to produce timber, and in the remaining acres, harvest can be used as a management tool, but the production of timber is not the focus. Now I want to take a quick poll from the audience. How many acres do you think that the Shawnee has harvested in the last 10 years? I heard a guess of 3,000 in the front, 12,000. I think I heard 20,000 in the back. The answer is 772 acres, or 0.003% of the total forested land. Now we've sold about double that. It just hasn't been cut yet. Current total available for harvest under NEPA is about 7,000 acres, or 0.03%. Most of these acres are areas where we're trying to convert non-native pine stands over to native hardwoods, and more recently some hardwood harvests to improve forest health conditions and address the loss of oak hickory ecosystem to a compositional shift to a more mesic forest types. Now I told you I wouldn't preach forest health, so I'll leave it at that, but I wanted to stress we have a lot of forested land in decline and in need of treatment that isn't getting addressed at any large scale, but something is better than nothing when moving towards a desired goal. So with that, I wanted to share some of the information about harvest activities that have occurred on the Shawnee. The Lee Mine project proposed 572 acres of shelterwood harvesting to convert non-native pine stands over to native hardwoods with an emphasis on oak hickory. The term shelterwood here is confusing if you understand the silvicultural term. Most of the time in a shelterwood, you're trying to regenerate the same forest type as the overstory trees by manipulating light conditions favorable for regeneration. But science has proven that to regenerate most pine, like we have here, you have to aggressively control the hardwood competition underneath that will outcompete the pine. In this case, we are using the shelter of the overstory trees to manipulate light conditions favorable to hardwood regeneration instead of pine, and then tending the desired hardwood regeneration underneath. Pine stands in the project area were experiencing overcrowding with very dark conditions underneath. Hardwood regeneration was present in the understory with a good portion of those oak and hickory, but in response to low light conditions, most have lost their ability to grow up and were flattening out in search of light. Like most stands on the Shawnee that haven't been managed, the regeneration pool was skewed towards shade-tolerant and light-seeded species. Though native, they have a low wildlife value and ecological diversity than mass-producing oak and hickory common to southern Illinois. If we were to remove all the overstory pine in one shot, the majority of the oak and hickory regeneration present wouldn't respond positively and would need to be cut to resprout and start growing up again. The stand undoubtedly would regenerate to hardwoods, but oak and hickory would be more of a minor component if nothing else was done. Introducing prescribed fire and manual release activities could increase the oak and hickory component while keeping the area in an open condition longer. It's not a bad thing because young forest or open vegetation is lacking across southern Illinois. It's just a different pathway back to a mature forest. So I pretty much talked about the objectives of the Lee Mine project, and the silvicultural tools utilized here is commercial harvesting, which we're calling a shelter wood. There will be some manual cutting after the harvest, and then use of prescribed fire several years down the road. The mechanism to get this completed was a timber sale contract, and in particular, the contractor had what's called in-woods processing, which I'll touch on here shortly. In most pine harvests on the Shawnee, we're taking a slower approach to restoring these areas back to hardwood by reducing the pine density slower and tending the regeneration underneath to be a more desirable species mixture and get them to a free-to-grow state that will respond to release when the majority of the overstory pine is removed. So basically, you have a young forest in place when the overstory is reduced further. In Lee Mine, we have 3 separate timber sales. All 3 sales have been marked and sold, but not all the cutting has occurred. After layout, the total harvest acres reduced by 100 acres to about 470. Most all of the stands that have been harvested with what's called in-woods processing, which some of you might be familiar with, but I bet there's a number of you that aren't. More common to southern Illinois is whole tree operations with feller bunchers and skidders, where the feller buncher cuts the tree and lays it down, and then the skidder grabs it and takes the whole tree to the landing to be processed. With in-woods processing, harvesting like this Komatsu processor, the logs are cut to length in the woods, and the forwarder comes and picks up the piles and puts it on its back. Instead of driving to every tree that is cut, the harvester follows a trail and can reach 25 to 30 foot on each side, bring the tree to the machine, and then process it right there in front of it. The tops are used as a slash mat for the machine to drive over. Overall, the harvest is lighter on the ground. The landings are also smaller because the trees have already been processed. Right, stop talking and let's see some action. You'll see in the video that the harvester has already cut the tree and brought it to its location, and will process the tree into desired lengths and pile them up along the trail. The operator inside can see the diameter, the length, everything on that tree, and depending on how they're marketing the products, will bump the head along the log to cut the desired lengths and pile them up. All credit goes to my awesome sale administrator, Jim. Next, the forwarder will drive down the trails and pick up the log bunks that the processor had made. It'll pick them up, it'll put them on their back, and it'll drive out to the landing. So none of the wood is drug across the ground. Once the forwarder gets back to the landing, it can unload itself and stack the logs alongside the road to where the truck can just come up and be loaded right next to the log bunk. There's no other machines that need to be on the landing to process any of the trees. I thought I would share those videos of what in-woods processing is because I get questions about it quite often. But regardless of the equipment that is used to complete the harvest, the result is more open forest where light is reaching the forest floor. Pine density has been reduced but is still present in the overstory, but just at a wider spacing. This is Copperhead Road, Payment Unit 3, not at the same location, but on the left is pre-harvest and on the right is post-harvest. The AgriPelter sale was the second of 3 sales in the Lee Mine project. I thought I would share a little bit about one of the units. Payment Unit 1 is a 32-acre shortleaf pine plantation with a year of origin of 1941. It was fairly dense with 174 square feet of basal area per acre. If you don't know what basal area is, basal area is a cross-sectional area of all the trees present at breast height expressed over a unit of land, which in this case would be an acre. That term expresses stand density when using forest-type stocking charts. The prescription called for cutting the stand down to 80 square feet and start by thinning from below the canopy, and then once you've met the objectives below, then move to the overstory trees to reach your spacing and get light to the forest floor. We utilized the sale contract for this cutting down to 80 feet, and then post-sale we'd come in and cut down the smaller stems by hand to bring the basal area down to 65. The regeneration layer consisted of about 6,900 trees per acre, which is quite a few, and about 1,400 of those being oak and hickory. However, as I talked earlier, most all of the oak and hickory were not ready to be released from the past dense shading. So the picture on the left shows the stand prior to cutting. Payment Unit 1 was cut this past fall and completed this past fall. You can see from the picture here that the crown is much more widely spaced. The stand looks less cluttered and the slash is low and scattered evenly across the unit. Light is now reaching the forest floor. Stand vigor and visuals have been improved. We will return to this unit probably in the fall of 2021 and manually cut down some of that smaller understory and mid-story trees to get a little more sunlight to the ground and to reset some flat top stems. After monitoring the regeneration and their ability to take fire, we'll implement a prescribed fire several years down the road. Most likely, we'll need to implement a second burn or a manual release to get the desired regeneration competitive. Once we get the regeneration layer at about 4.5 feet or above and ready for release, we'll come back and remove the majority of the overstory. This restoration to hardwoods is a process and could take anywhere from 7 to 15 years after the initial harvest. But the initial entry provides a more open forest structure that's lacking in most of the stands, especially pine stands. Some of you might be aware that we had an unusual and rare visitor to the Lee Mine project area this past winter. The Douglas fir and Sitka spruce red crossbills, native to the Pacific Northwest and Western Canada, were located feeding almost exclusively on the shortleaf cones in the harvest units of Copperhead Road and Agripelter. It drew quite a few people in the birding community to the site, and it was actually highlighted nationally in the Forest Service. So a pretty neat story. Another project that's underway on the Shawnee comes out of the Waterfall Stewardship project. Waterfall is a 560-acre project area of oak hickory, pine, and mixed hardwood forest types. Harvesting is approved on 485 acres to improve forest health by reducing overstock conditions, improve the oak hickory ecosystem resilience through the promotion of oak hickory regeneration and the associated native ground flora, and to improve wildlife habitat with variable forest structure. The project also addresses NNIS concerns and watershed health by eliminating and restoring old roads that are contributing sediment to the watershed. The silvicultural tools used here are harvesting, manual stand improvement cutting, herbicide, planting, and burning. The first project sale out of Waterfall is called the Equalizer Stewardship sale. It's about 199 acres of the total project, and the mechanism to complete that is a stewardship contract. In this case is an IRTC, which is an integrated resource timber contract, in which the Forest Service sells goods, which is in this case timber, for service items. And for this project, it would be maintenance of some problem roads within the Kincaid watershed. So the purchaser would do maintenance on those roads as service items, and we would pay for that with the timber. To date, no harvesting has occurred within the Waterfall project, but the first sale, Equalizer, is out for bids at this time. Since the decision was signed in late 2019, we've focused on trying to limit and control some non-native invasive species within the project, which included treating NNIS along roads that would be utilized during the contract, as well as trying to control some pockets of tree of heaven. The picture on the right is actually from the project area, a pocket of about a half acre of 10 to 16 inch tree of heaven that we did a hack and squirt treatment on, and we've treated it several times since the initial treatment. The prescriptions for the Equalizer project are a little different because it includes hardwood stands rather than just pine. However, the pine prescription that you in Equalizer, because there is about 40 acres of pine in this sale, is very similar to that we talked about in the Lee Mine project. For the hardwoods, it's a little different. In there, we're looking to get a crown closure to promote enough light to the forest floor to promote oak and hickory. In that we were shooting for about a 65% crown closure through the harvest, and that's the way the stand was marked based on that crown closure. The markers focused on leaving the largest, healthiest trees that can provide a seed source to the next regeneration class. You can see in the picture the trees that are left, the trees that are marked in blue will come out. Those are overtopped, suppressed, poor form trees underneath, and leaving the largest trees behind to support the seed source to get regeneration on the ground. A lot of what's coming out of this area is shade tolerant, light seeded species. I mean, the majority of species marked was tulip poplar and then other associated hardwoods. Now some oak is coming out. Those are poor formed trees, or to improve, spacing of a better tree. But for the most part, oak and hickory is on the lowest end of what's coming out of these stands, and leaving those behind to provide a seed source, and then removing those light seeded, shade tolerant species from underneath. Post-harvest, we would come back through here and we would cut down some of the smaller non-merchantable trees that couldn't be sold during the timber contract, and we'd also run fire through here, and in hopes to start getting some oak and hickory that can get to that mid-story and not be shaded out from competitors. During harvesting, some ground is going to be impacted despite the equipment you use. This is most commonly found on landings where logs are decked, and main skid trails where the equipment is moving through the woods. These areas are slower to recover, but most commonly are used during future management activities to keep the impacts concentrated to those locations. The last thing I wanted to talk about is a collaborative between research and the National Forest System happening on the Shawnee. It includes researchers from the Northern and Rocky Mountain research stations, as well as employees from the Mark Twain, Hoosier, Shawnee Regional Office, and Washington Office. The collaborative is conducting a study to look at turning log landings and skid trails into functional ephemeral pollinator habitat by using a variety of treatments and locations across the 3 national forests. We will be testing subsoiling treatments along with biochar applications to mitigate compaction with and without the application of native seed mixes to establish pollinator habitat. Each landing across the national forest will have all treatment combinations implemented and monitored on the footprint. You can see that there will be treatments with and without subsoiling, with and without biochar or seed, and there will also be a control. So we'll be able to look at a variety of treatments and see what sort of response we get from each of those. The study will examine soil remediation methods and the use of biochar, various methods to establish pollinator habitat, and then look at bee response to the habitat. The hope is to apply these findings widely, not just on the national forest lands, but to all lands where management is occurring. We're early in this study, so there are no findings to report, and biochar was actually applied to the Shawnee sites just last week, and the other treatments will occur here soon. I don't know if you noticed, but as we progressed through the projects that we talked about today, the silvicultural toolbox seemed to get larger. That's because forest management and the associated silvicultural techniques are not a one-size-fits-all. There are several tools that land managers can utilize to meet their specific objectives, and most of the time all of them are needed, including the mechanisms to accomplish them. The Shawnee has a great partnership base, and it's displayed in a lot of what I shared here today. I hope you enjoyed hearing about some of the restoration and forest management projects that are happening on the Shawnee, and with that, I'll take any questions.